Welcome to the Healing My Parts podcast, a podcast dedicated to educating and raising awareness about dissociative identity disorder, also known as DID. We are your hosts, the system behind Healing My Parts, which also includes parts that function as a therapist and leader in a mental health niche space. We'll be sharing tips and tools that have helped us and many others, while also sharing insights from our own journey of living with the condition. We'll also be hosting guests for conversations to help educate, dispel myths, and most especially help those living with dissociative identities and professionals who treat the condition. Thank you so much for tuning in. And now, let's get healing. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to welcome today's guest, who is a social worker, author, and longtime advocate for honoring dissociative identities in therapy, Greg Nooney. And before we dive into a great list of questions, Greg, I wonder, first, welcome, and could you let folks know a little bit about you, what you do, and anything you'd like them to know?
Sure, and thank you, Monica, for providing this forum for me. I'm quite honored to be able to talk to all of you. So I'm actually, Thanksgiving, I'm going to be turning 75. And so I've worked in mental health for about 40 years, mostly in community mental health centers. And over the time, I've worked with obviously lots of folks, and basically I've kind of specialized in people with dissociative identities in the last 10 or 15 years, although one of my very first clients, when I started doing outpatient work in 1990, was a person that was diagnosed with, that I diagnosed with multiple personality disorder back then, which is the diagnosis. So I started with that. And one of the things that I think about is that I've written 2 books on the topic, and I'm working on my 3rd book. And I often thought that I was writing the book for myself. If I could have read it back in 1990, I would have been a much better therapist than I was at the time. Yeah. So more about me. I graduated from Loyola University in Chicago with my master's in social work in 1983. I'm married with 4 adult children, live in Iowa, and have a garden and a cat. And that's about it for now.
All of the listeners love people who have pets, whether it's cats or dogs, or still waiting for somebody to have a pet llama come on just because. Why not?
Yeah, why not?
One of the things that I know we got to have a brief conversation before we hopped on to record is your incredible compassion for folks with dissociative identities. And you've been in the field for a long time, since the 90s, and everyone listening knows I have strong feelings about the 90s. It was not a gentle decade for me personally. How have you seen the landscape shift or not shift when it comes to clinicians working with folks who have dissociative identities?
Yeah, so the first client I had, which was one of my first clients as an outpatient therapist, I immediately went to my supervisor and said, who can I refer this person to? Because I have no idea what I'm doing. But I had no idea what I was doing anyway, but especially working with somebody with dissociative identities. And she said, well, there's nobody else here in the mental health center that knows how to do it either. So it looks like it's up to you. And I said, well, we refer her to somebody in the community? Because I knew there were 2 people in the community at that time that were working with people with multiple personality disorder. And she said, no, because this person is poor. There was no Obamacare back then. There was no Medicaid for adults without children. It's like, this is the only place she could, if she wants therapy, this is the only place she can get it, basically. So fortunately, she sent me for some trainings back then. I went to Minneapolis for a training. And so I went to the client and I said, here's the deal. I don't know anything about how to do this, but if you want, we can learn together. And she said, yeah, that's fine. So that's got me launched in this work. So back then, I think it was seen, I'm not sure, hopefully it's changed a little bit, but back then it was seen as kind of a woo-woo kind of therapy. The people that are doing it were kind of out there, weird. And I think that's probably still true to a lot of extent, unfortunately. So when I was trained, I'm going to talk about trauma for a minute. When I was trained at Loyola University, from 1980 to 1983 in the social work department, I don't think we ever talked about trauma. I mean,
Wow.
that wasn't even in our language back then.
Wow.
So yeah. So, obviously that's changed. People are certainly aware of trauma, although the DSM certainly isn't that aware of trauma. I mean, they made that decision way back that they would kind of ignore etiology because there was too much controversy on what caused things. So they just said, well, just pretend like it doesn't exist. I mean, there's some exceptions, like PTSD requires a traumatic event. But basically, they said, we'll just come up with a description of symptoms and you can move those around and, form a diagnosis, And there's some advantages to that, obviously. You want to have some kind of common language. But by ignoring etiology, they're kind of still back in the dark ages.
It's kind of shocking to hear that there was a time that the DSM and professionals sort of ignored trauma. It's so widespread.
Yes, for sure. So that's a good thing that people are aware of it.
Yeah.
But people are, going into the question of dissociative identities. I think that, the pervasiveness of the DSM and the medical model, basically, in order to get paid, let me go back a minute. I think we made maybe a pact with the devil at some point and said, if we want to do therapy, we want to get paid. People can't afford to pay what we need to make a living. So we made a pact with insurance companies and we said, what we're doing isn't actually therapy, it's actually a medical intervention. And therefore you have to pay us for it. So we got paid, but that means the insurance company can say, well, I don't think that what you're doing is medically necessary. So I'm not going to pay you. Okay. And so we're stuck with this idea that we have to make a normalizing judgment on somebody. We have to pretend like we know what normal is and then decide whether the person in front of me is pathologically upset enough to meet the criteria of being abnormal so that I can give them a diagnosis so I can get paid. So it's pretty awful. I mean, it kind of goes against social work ethics in my view. But on the other hand, I think we have to live in these gray areas, As long as I make a pact with a particular insurance company, I also have an ethical obligation to follow that pact. So I think we have to live in those gray areas and we have to understand paradoxes all the time, which in a way helps in working with people with dissociative identities because there's all kinds of paradoxes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just want to circle to the 90s again for a moment. Were you personally impacted in your practice by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and in your treatment of folks who have DID? Or did you manage to kind of skirt around that? I was just curious.
Yeah, I really wasn't that aware of it at the time, to be honest. It didn't seem to impact me. And I think part of it was because I was in a community mental health center. And so, we just served anybody that came and there wasn't a lot of oversight, which probably was bad in some ways, but in this case might have been good.
I was just curious because that was a period of time I met so many people that were afraid, and it wasn't that easy to get good care. I was curious if you lived with any of that fear as a clinician because I know you're so passionate about the work that you do, and it's awful to feel constrained by these outside forces, whether they're insurance or somebody who decided that they just don't like a diagnosis and are going to come after your license as a result of trying to help people and treat it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember being that affected by it. I mean, I knew about it, but I don't remember being that affected by it.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned at one point holding many layers of privilege and that you approach this work from kind of an outsider lens rather than somebody with lived experience. That self-awareness in many ways feels a bit rare and pretty refreshing. I feel like, folks who have lived experience who are clinicians will say that and acknowledge it, but sometimes you don't hear people acknowledge that when they don't have lived experience. Can you speak a little bit to why you think it's important for clinicians to name those dynamics up front?
Well, because it's so powerful, I mean, it's like the rules in our society aren't fair, and people with privilege have all kinds of opportunities that people that don't have privilege don't have. And so if you don't mention it, you kind of render that invisible, where you just pretend like everybody's operating under the same rules, which is clearly not true. And people with privilege have I have all kinds of opportunities in my life because I'm white and male and straight and, you know, cisgender, and even being married is a privilege in this culture. I'm an educated person. So, I mean, just saying it doesn't really do much except to just acknowledge that I have these, I wouldn't be where I was if it wasn't for those privileges. And people say, well, so and so has all these lack of privilege, but look how far they've come. Well, yeah, of course, there's going to be a few people like that, but
Yeah. I think it does do something though, when you acknowledge those privileges in an email actually up front, what it told me was that you're sensitive to the power dynamic versus somebody who doesn't necessarily name it. You can get kind of run over a little bit by those power dynamics if the other person isn't aware of their privilege.
very good point. Yeah, because it's hard for the person on the down position to bring it up
Yeah.
for obvious reasons, because they're on the other side of the power differential. And so I think it probably helps a little bit. I don't want to, I think everybody should do it. I don't think I should have some special acknowledgement because I do it, because I think everybody should do it, so.
I agree. And that makes some differences in the world. You did mention a privilege that people don't typically acknowledge, though, and that was the one of having secure attachment status.
Yes, yes. Well, I think the data is pretty clear that a person with secure attachment status, which they don't earn, they're just born with it, they're just lucky enough to have parents that love them, not perfectly, but perfectly enough
Yeah.
that they can form that kind of a secure attachment. The data is clear that if you have that, your chances of having a productive, functional life are much higher than if you have an insecure attachment. I mean, it's just clear. So I think now, interesting, of all of the privileges that I mentioned, basically all of those privileges are set, and you can't really change them. Although the one that you can change, interestingly, is the secure attachment status, because it's possible to have an earned secure attachment, which is the reason we have therapy, right?
Oh,
That's our
interesting.
goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I want to mention too the outsider knowledge versus insider knowledge in the singular identity, which I mentioned as a privilege. So the outsider knowledge versus insider knowledge, I think, is really important because it reminds me that, I write these books and I think they're helpful. I hope they're helpful. And I try to not make assumptions. One of the things that I think is really important in this work is to be curious, and every system is different. And my curiosity is my friend. But in order to be curious, I have to be aware of my biases. Okay. And even in my book, there's biases. Michael White is this co-founder of narrative therapy, which is one of my teachers. And one of the things he says is there's no such thing as a neutral question. Okay. Because what am I curious about? Okay. If somebody says, oh, I had a really problem last night because I don't know, I slept with somebody and I wish I hadn't slept with them. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, I would not be curious about why they did that. I would never ask, why did you do that? That's none of my business. It focuses on something that isn't going to be helpful, because it assumes, first of all, that they have a reason, or that they know that they only have one reason and they happen to know what it is, which is people are multi-motived, obviously. So I wouldn't be curious about that, but I might be curious about other things. What led up to this? How did you make that decision? Were you aware of making that decision? If it was a person with a plural identity, I might ask, well, who made that decision and who was involved in it? How did it come about? What was it like? But how did it affect the littles? So all kind of questions that I can ask that I'd be curious about that are helpful. But there's a lot of questions I can ask that would not be helpful. And so people say, well, ask open-ended questions. Well, sometimes open-ended questions are best. Sometimes closed-ended questions are best, And you can ask an open-ended question that's the wrong question. So if a person is a therapist and also has lived experience, I would propose they also have outsider knowledge because they don't know what's going on inside that person's system. And when I supervise therapists, not even just with people with multiple identities, but I often let people know that it's probably more dangerous when you're working with somebody that's similar to you than when somebody that's different from you, especially if you have that curiosity. If I'm working with somebody from a different culture, I'd be curious about their culture. I'm working with a woman who has woman experience. I'm interested in what their experience is, but I know I don't have that experience. But let's say, for example, I have somebody I supervise who is a strong Christian. And I explained to her, and she's very open to other religions, and she doesn't preach or anything like that. But I cautioned her that if you're working with somebody who is a Christian, you better be careful because you might think that they believe the same thing you believe.
Yeah.
They probably don't. So you have to always hold on to that. You always have outsider knowledge.
You're so right. In my both opinion and experience, I think about supervisees in other realms. I work with folks who have eating disorders, and lots of people that are in recovery will get into the field as a result of their experience. They want to give back, they want to help people. And it is really true that a lot of times younger folks will sort of superimpose their own recovery experience onto all of their clients and expect what worked for them to work for their clients, right? And
Yes.
that's not how it works. It's like what worked for you doesn't necessarily work for other people. So we're just kind of contributing to a bank of options and opportunities, hopefully, for our clients to go inside and access their own internal wisdom to check out what might be helpful for them so they can try and move forward. But it's shocking when some folks come into the field and realize, oh, the stuff that worked for me
Yeah.
isn't helping this other person at all, and I don't
Right.
necessarily know what to do with them. And then you can
Right.
move to that space of curiosity and open-ended
Yes.
questions.
And when you think about culture, it's like there's this, in social work ethics is the idea of being culturally aware,
Yeah.
but culturally competent. And, culture is complicated. It isn't just, your race or your ethnic origin. There's all kinds of things about culture. There's motorcycle culture. There's all kinds of culture. But I think that with culture, one of the things that Michael White taught me is that, yes, be aware of people, some ideas about the culture, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be part of that. But so one of the things Michael White says is that in some sense, each person has their own culture. And you have to be curious about how they, even if they're strong, I'm a strong Christian, I'm a strong Muslim, or whatever it is, well, how does that work for you? What does that mean for you? For example, there are Muslim people that believe that women should be submissive to men. And there's the evangelical culture that often has that belief. But everybody in that culture doesn't believe that. There are people that are fighting against that. And they're still part of that culture, right? I consider myself to be a cultural Catholic, but I don't believe in the dogma of the Catholic Church. But I've been affected, and I grew up as a Catholic in a Catholic culture, and it affected me in many ways, some positive and some negative. So let's talk about singular identity. So I think that's another thing that I want to acknowledge, that I have a singular identity. And I think that's something that is important to acknowledge because I'm coming from that perspective. People that have a singular identity, I can't speak for all of them, but we tend to think that's normal. That's what we were taught, that there was no idea that there's such a thing as somebody with multiple identities. So, and I think even in the culture of psychotherapy, there's a pervasive belief that singular identity is not only preferable, but is normal. And a multiple identity needs to be eradicated, which I think is a form of violence, actually.
I agree. I stumble a lot on that one. I think it's an ableist view as well. If we're taking a singular identity as the quote unquote normative, and it might be the most common, I don't actually know if it is or not, thinking that everybody can somehow get there feels really ableist to me. I don't know that that's true. And a lot of people don't want to anyway.
If there was evidence that living with multiple identities was impossible to live a functional, healthy, wonderful life, if there was there's no evidence of that.
Right.
If there was evidence of that, there might be some reason to think, well, maybe we should try to help people achieve. And even this notion, achieve a singular identity. Well, why do we have to achieve it? I mean, I don't think we tell people that are neurodivergent, you should achieve neurotypicalness.
You need to have an
that would
holistic
be,
brain instead of an autistic brain.
yeah. I mean, I think at some point, some of the so-called therapeutic techniques were trying to do that.
Yeah.
At least you should at least pretend to be.
Those are the places where I feel like client autonomy, agency, and self-determination get left behind. When you have providers who are deciding that you have to look a certain way or behave a certain way or have a certain internal experience. And your point is so well taken. There are many, many people out there with plural identities who have really full, fluidly functional lives. There have been plenty of times in my own life, which I think, at least on paper, I look pretty functional. So there can be times, right, where I could say, gosh, I wish that X, Y, or Z was less confusing, but the confusion or whatever was happening internally didn't impede my ability to live a full life. There's a both and that we sometimes don't live in the professional world, I think. Many people do. So if people are listening, I don't want people to take offense. If you are somebody who is able to hold the dialectics and you're holding it with compassion and curiosity, then clearly we're not speaking to you directly. But it exists, right? There are people that struggle with that and feel like they need to make everyone look the same in a singular identity or have a quote unquote core self, which I know you have some thoughts about as well.
Yes. So I think that it kind of relates, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
if you have in the back of your mind this idea that a singular identity is preferable or normative, that everybody should try to reach that. And again, I don't want to say anything against people that maybe started out with a multiple identity and were able to become a singular identity. I'm sure there are people like that feel great about that experience. So going along with that, if you have that belief, or even if you're not thinking about it, again, it's good to talk about this, because otherwise there's a lot of things we assume that we don't talk about. So at least even talking about it is helpful, okay? Because otherwise there's a lot of things we just assume that we don't even think about, okay? Like, I have this notion that I have a singular identity and that this Greg Nooney that's 75 is the same Greg Nooney that was 15 or 20. And I think that's probably a delusion, actually. I mean, I'm not the same, but I have this idea that there's this core me. I believe that about myself, okay? But I don't believe that it's necessarily true for everybody. I think it's kind of a spiritual belief. And I don't believe in putting out my spiritual, expecting people to believe the same thing I believe. But I have to acknowledge that I believe that's been my experience. Although sometimes I doubt it, and I've been influenced by Buddhism, and my wife is a Buddhist, and there's a notion that the ego is a made-up thing, which I think it is probably a made-up thing. I don't know. But that gets into a whole a spiritual question that isn't, people, and obviously my clients can talk about that if they want. I'm interested in what they think, but I don't want to impose these ideas on people. And so I think IFS has done a service to the community, the world, and the culture of psychotherapy by pointing out how important it is that we look at our parts. And most people have a sense of parts. But they didn't invent it. I mean, Gestalt did parts work. Sigmund Freud did parts work. All kinds of ego state therapy. This isn't an invention, but it's become more popular, and so people are more aware of it, and that's probably a good thing. My problem with IFS in working with, let me back up a minute. I think it's wonderful to be trained in IFS and still work with DID clients or people with multiple identities, but I don't think that there's certain aspects of IFS that I think you need to let go of if you're working with people with multiple identities. And one of them is this idea that there's a core self, that every part has a self energy that can come into them. And that may be true for some people, but I don't think it's true for everybody. And also, I think it's a mistake, not just with IFS ideas, but with any ideas to walk into a therapy room with somebody with multiple identities and to think that you have a structure that has to fit onto their system. You know, that, okay, which one of these are protectors and which one are exiles and which one are managers? You have that idea that this is how every system is structured. So whatever they say, you try to put it into that system. Now, I don't pretend to be immune from that. One of my things that I've been playing with, one of these handouts, which I think you may have shared with people, is I have this idea that when you look at someone's inner system, you can look at things like complexity and structure and organization and how many layers of alters are there, what are how are responsible adults dealt with, how about the dissociative barriers. So this is a structure that I've imposed in a sense, but I want it to be very loose. You know, and if somebody says, well, I don't care about complexity, my system isn't complex or it isn't simple, it's something else. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to impose that, but I think it's helpful to have some kind of, we have to have some kind of a way of looking at things. But we have to always be cautious on any way that we try to organize something. If I can do a name dropping here, one of my books, Jamie Merrick commented on it, and she said, I just love the fact that she said this.
Jamie's
She
great.
said, yeah, she said, while every client or system with dissociative identities is unique, and bringing concepts together into a single manual or resource is next to impossible, Greg does the closest thing possible with great competence in this book.
I love that.
Yeah. So I don't pretend to achieve that. But if I come as close as possible, that's I've reached my, that's like winning an award or something.
I love what you're naming, though. I think it's one of the things, at least in the community, that feels really, in the DID community, that feels so frustrating is this, oh boy, let's see if I can articulate this. The belief that you're naming, right, where many clinicians believe that there is this core self. And I love that you're acknowledging that it's not really the case for all people. And yes, there is this spiritual belief that some people have that everyone has a higher self, or it's this self energy that then reportedly can be in every part and may not exist for everyone. Followed by a lot of folks who have had training in IFS, and I agree with you. I think that IFS has made many positive contributions to the field, but it's also contributed a significant amount of confusion for clinicians who are trying to treat people who have DID, because I don't want to say everyone, but many of them really struggle categorically to understand the differences between the iterations of themselves that they find in their IFS-like system and the really distinct, well-defined parts that you find in a DID system. To the degree that even when I've been giving trainings, and mental health centers did one a couple months ago, there were people that just could not understand the difference and suggested that maybe I was confused. They didn't know that I have lived experience with DID, but they suggested maybe I was confused and I need a little more training in IFS. And that, but the language is so convoluted, it's very challenging to explain the difference sometimes because it sounds the same, but it's so different.
Yes, yes. And people often, when I've worked with people initially often I work with people that don't identify as having plural identity when I first meet them, and sometimes they're not even aware of it themselves, or at least, let me say it another way, the alter that I'm talking to is not aware of it.
Yeah.
Somebody's aware of it,
Yeah.
probably. The what I call the primary alter may not be aware of it. But a lot of these folks, when they first come to me, the alter that I'm talking to is confused about whether they have a system and how the system is organized. So if you have somebody with some power in that relationship come in and say, well, this is how your system is organized. They're going to say, okay, well, I'll try to make it fit, right? I don't want to offend my therapist, and you might send me to the hospital because you might think I'm crazy. So I'll find a way to make it fit. And people with multiple identities are really good at fitting in,
Yeah. Yep.
right?
Yep.
I mean, you know what people know? Do you have voices? Well, no, not exactly, but yeah, I kind of do. Oh, okay. Yeah, I got a good medicine for you.
Yeah. I mean, you're definitely walking in, many of us walk in, right, with a certain subset of knowledge and you know what to say and what not to say while you're trying to figure it out for yourself. It's refreshing when folks can meet someone like yourself and just be able to lay it all out. I'm confused about this. This is what I hear. This is what I don't hear. This is what I wish I heard. And have someone accept that without trying to rearrange a system immediately.
Yeah, and most of what I've learned about plural systems have been with my clients. I went to some trainings back in the 90s. I can't really remember what I learned, and I just learned it from the folks that I work with. They explain it to me. Well, this is what's going on. Or I don't know what's going on. Well, I don't know either. Let's talk about it. Maybe we can figure it out together.
Yeah. What I'm trying to think of the word that I want to use. Advice, guidance, feedback, one of those words. Would you give or do you have for clinicians who are really interested in working with folks who have DID or OSDD, and have been initially either they're reading books or they went to trainings that talk about the necessity of integration and fusion?
Yeah, stop going to those trainings. That's my advice.
Excellent
It's just going to
advice.
confuse you. Yeah. I do have some thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think that there's really a problem that there's so many therapists that won't work with people with multiple identities. And what I like to promote this idea, first of all, that you have to have some knowledge about early childhood trauma. You have to be kind of a trauma therapist. I think that's important to start with. Okay. You have to have heard about PTSD maybe at some point in your career. And you don't think that, I don't know if we want to get into talk about borderline personality disorder, but I can't help but, okay, so I don't think that the vast majority of people that are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder actually have a personality disorder. It's a trauma response, and it's a little different than a PTSD trauma response. And a lot of them actually have DID or OSDD. And some research said, I think, at least 11%. So people need to understand, just forget that, oh, wow, I think that they want a new therapist. They must have borderline personality disorder or something. Like people have these, how do you diagnose borderline personality disorder? If you're having trouble with countertransference, and they probably have borderline personality disorder. That's sort of the way people think. I think about them too much, They must be borderline, right? I mean, it's crazy stuff, but hopefully that's changing. I think Marsha Linehan changed that when she said, hey, wait a minute,
Yeah.
let's work with these folks like myself, right?
I'm sort of sad for people that are afraid to work with people who have DID and OSDD because I find the work really, really deeply I don't know, it's an honor. It's deeply gratifying. It's exciting. It's interesting. There are so many wonderful things about it. I'm totally biased, but I think people get overwhelmed sometimes by watching too much television. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but honestly, there is this idea that every single person with DID is going to be calling you 50 times a day and needs crisis intervention every day. And that's not the case, you know? Most folks who have DID and OSDD are absolutely looking for the parameters in therapy. So I do think good boundaries are important. Like, name what they are, and many
Yes.
systems will
Yeah.
stay within them.
Yes. 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 Yeah. For sure. So I think that people need to understand trauma and see themselves as a trauma therapist. But if they have that, then I think they can work with people with multiple identities and be helpful to have some consultation and be helpful to talk to people. And things might feel scary, I don't know who this little child came out today in my office. I didn't know what to do. Well, how do you work with other children? Sit on the floor, ask them what they need today. It's not that complicated, really. Yeah, but people have to be flexible. They have to say, okay, let's see what's happening here. Let's be curious. And yeah, so I think that, I agree with you. It's fun sometimes. and, and folks I work with are so creative and so flexible often. And
I just realized I should probably put parameters around what I considered fun, right? Because if people are listening and thinking that I mean it's all the trauma processing that's fun, that's not what I mean. I'm here
no,
for
no,
it, but it's
yeah,
helping people do things like figure out their internal worlds, how their system works, who does what well, who gets along with
yes,
who, building up their inner world, using it in different creative ways that helps them function differently and better and easier in the world. Those are the things that are fun. I don't think anybody's
yes,
pain or trauma is fun by any means. And I just realized that that could have been taken totally out of
yeah. Well,
context. So,
thank you for
whew,
clarifying that. I agree with you totally. Yeah. So I think, once you have that, I think the key is curiosity
yeah,
and non-judgmentalism and let go. There's this quote, I don't know if it's an actual quote, but I repeat it as if it is, that Carl Jung once said, learn everything you can, but when you sit down with the patient, forget everything you know.
I love that. That's beautiful.
So I do think that therapists need to do their own work and they need to deal with their own trauma, their own parts that hurting and so forth. And I did come up with like 10 aspirations that I think therapists should try to aspire to, which I think you might send out share that with people. So I think that's important to always check. And also, we make mistakes. I ask questions that aren't good questions,
We all do that.
and that's okay. Yeah. And, just say, oh, okay, was that a good question? No, it wasn't. Oh, I want to talk about trauma. So a lot of people around the country consult with me because they're working with people with DID. And one of the things that I say to them is, I have this concept, and again, I'm happy to have it not be true if it's not true for somebody, but this concept that the reason people have separate alters, I like to use the term alter, but whatever term the client uses is fine. So as an alternate identity. So the reason that there are separations between alters is because there's a dissociative barrier between them. And the dissociative barrier was created for a very good reason. For example, if I want to function at school, I can't remember what happened last night when I was abused. So I don't remember it, but there's another part that remembers it, right? And that can be expanded to all kinds of different divisions. So I think that having those dissociative barriers become at least semi-permeable is necessary in order to have some kind of communication among the alters. So my idea is that in order to have a better life, it's helpful to be able to have intercommunication and cooperation and some co-consciousness. So those are the 3 C's that I talk about: communication, cooperation, and co-consciousness. And that's kind of the meat of the work, I think. I feel funny saying that because I'm a vegetarian, but anyway, the meat of the work, I don't know what other word to use,
Bulk? I don't know.
the bulk, yeah. And that's difficult often for people with plural identities
Yeah.
because that those divisions are there for a reason. You don't want to break them down too quickly. So when I work with therapists around the country that consult with me, they'll often say, well, they want to tell me all the trauma history of the person. I say, I'm not that interested in it.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's important to know that they had trauma as a child, but we kind of know that anyway if they have multiple identities. So I often tell people, don't even talk about it. I mean, obviously, if someone brings them and they want to talk about this trauma, even then, sometimes I'll stop the client and say, well, are you sure you want to talk about that right now? I know you want to talk about it, but how is that going to affect the others inside? How about the littles? Are they listening? Do you want them to listen? We don't have to talk about it right now, but if you want to, we can. But I just want you to be aware of how it might affect your system. Don't worry about how it affects me, but worry about how it affects your system. And, I like this idea of a trauma list. Let's make a list and I'll put it in my computer or something. And then when we're ready to go into it later, when things are kind of sorted out and you kind of know where everybody is and, you can protect the littles and so forth, then we could talk about it more. So it's not that important. I mean, it's important, but it's not that important in the therapeutic context of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. Of course, it's important, but not.
When you think about helping your clients develop the 3 Cs, which are pretty critical to functioning well, arguably, it's hard to move through life when you don't know where half your time or more is gone or what you've done. It's difficult for
Yes.
system accountability if you don't know what you've done either.
Absolutely.
For a therapist's perspective, what resources would you guide folks to learn more about helping clients do that?
One thing is to always keep in the back of your mind, remind yourself that my client isn't the alter I'm talking to. My client is the system.
Yeah.
So when the person I'm talking to says, I have this conflict with my sister, we need to talk about it because she posted something on Facebook and she just hates me. And so if a person had a singular identity, there's certain ways you talk about that. Well, have you done some resourcing? What's your history with your sister? How important is your relationship with her? You can ask those kind of questions, obviously, with somebody with a multiple identity. But the person with a multiple identity has other resources internally that they forget about. Well, when you read that on Facebook, did you read it? Or was somebody else reading it with you? Or did you go away and let somebody else read it? And who's mostly affected by that? I wouldn't say why is it so important, but who's mostly affected by that? So actually, it makes therapy easier than with a single identity because a single identity, you have to look outside for resources. I mean, you can have inner resources. You can learn to breathe and to calm yourself down, meditate, and so on. But with somebody with a multiple identity, they have these resources that they forget about. They don't remember that they're there, or maybe there's a conflict between them and the other alters, so they don't want to ask, but there's a barrier between all kinds of things are possible. But basically, you do therapy like with anybody else, but you have additional questions you can ask, additional sentences you can say, and how, and it's always like, well, who's listening right now? And nobody's listening, it's like, there's a block there. Okay, well, okay. You can explore those things. And also, I always think about the inner world and the outer world. And there's usually a balance in sometimes. And in some sense, you can start either place. But I think even if you start at one place, let's say, well, we're going to talk about the internal world today. I really want to, would it be okay if you let some of the other alters out and meet me today? I'd love to meet them. We're going to focus. But even then, you're always thinking about how does this affect the outer world?
Yeah.
And similarly, as you're talking about the outer world, yeah, well, I want to go over to my sister's house and knock on the door. I'll tell her what's wrong. Okay, well, that's might be an option, but how will that affect the other ones inside? Who's going to come out and use a protector? This protector's kind of come out, and who controls that person? So it's always there's always both. But I think sometimes we focus more on one or more on the other, just depending on what's going on. Person comes in, my mother just died. Okay, wow, you have to deal with the funeral and everything. You have to deal with the world. But again, you can ask questions about who can you seek help from, your cousin and your sister, but also somebody inside. Can they take over if you get sad or, yeah. So is that making sense to you what I'm saying?
I mean, it makes sense to me because I live it, but
Okay,
because
well, good. Yeah.
it's true. I mean, I think there are places where, as somebody who has DID, you can be in whoever might be fronting can forget that there are other resources available in a moment that is really difficult, whether that is a triggering doctor's appointment, a challenging environment like being back with your family of origin, if that's where your trauma occurred, etc.
Yeah.
You can sometimes forget to prep your system. But when you do remember that you have those resources and you are able to ask, can parts who are going to struggle being in this environment go do X, Y, or Z in the inner world? I have a very vivid one. And can parts who are good at managing this person, or this dynamic either take over or help me out? Because I know it's going to be
Yeah.
difficult.
Yes.
When I first learned about that, I did not expect it to work. Because when I learned about that, I didn't have great communication with any part of my system.
Mhm, mhm.
So I was shocked to discover that you can ask internally and it can work. Like, just like
Wow.
literally astounded that something that is normally really, really difficult and challenging could go smoothly because someone else had actually taken over to manage it. And parts that were normally super triggered by whatever that experience was had actually receded and gone to do something different in the inner world.
It's wonderful.
Mind
Yeah.
blowing.
Yeah.
Things I wish I knew, 30 years ago.
Right. Right.
Do you
Yeah.
you have such great resources that you created. I was just kind of looking at your dimensional scales, and then you have the categorical model. Do you share those with your clients, or is that something that you use to primarily in consultation or supervision with other clinicians? Because I could see
Well,
where this could be really helpful for clients to look at.
well, that's what I'm hoping, that clients maybe can experiment with it and we can make changes or whatever. I haven't shared it with my clients because basically I developed it after I became semi-retired and I'm not really seeing any. I see a couple of clients, but they don't have DID right now. And so I don't really have that opportunity. I would love to, So I'm hoping that people will try it out, and they're in my book. My PESI book has them in there, and I'm hoping that people might try them out and see if it's helpful.
We can link to those resources or put them as
Oh, good.
downloads, right? So folks who are listening, if you look in the show notes, there will be links to either view or download those.
So in terms of your question of what can advise a therapist, there's a couple other thoughts I want to throw out there. One is to pay attention to the internal world. Be curious about the internal world specifically, not just, oh, I have an internal world. Well, can you tell me more about it? How is it structured? Do you have buildings or caves or tunnels? Well, I'm interested in it. I'm curious about it, but I especially want my client to become more curious about it.
Yeah.
Okay. And the more they know about their own system, even if I don't know, it's not that important for me to know. I like to know because I'm kind of curious, but if they can learn about their own system, it's much easier for them to do the 3 Cs.
Yeah.
Like if they want to talk to Peter, it's nice to know that he has a room on the east wing of his house,
Yep.
right? Otherwise, you might not know where he is, and you might not be there either. But yeah. So that's one thing. I want to throw out something. This Sufi, I don't know if people know about Sufi. It's the metaphysical aspect of Islam. And there's a Sufi story, and it goes like this. God created Adam out of moist red clay. A remnant remained, small remnant. He used that remnant to create Adam's sister, which is the palm tree. Okay. And she's everybody's auntie. Okay. After creating the palm tree, there was a tiny, tiny piece left, the size of a sesame seed. Okay. And so God took that sesame seed and created an alternate earth. And that's an earth that's between the material world and the world of the angels. And in that world, spirits are embodied and bodies are spiritualized. Okay. So I think that that's the world that people that have multiple, I think we all have an internal world, but people with multiple identities are more aware of it. And I think that's the world. It's a real world. It's a realm. I'm not a Sufi, but, you can take it metaphorically or whatever, but it's a real world. It's just as real as the outer world.
Yeah.
It has different rules. It's more flexible. Things can move around and change. It doesn't always follow the rules of the outside world.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, actually.
Really?
Yeah, because it's so powerful. And sometimes people get really dysphoric when they'll say things like, but I don't have an inner world. All I see is blackness. And I'm sure you find this as well, right? When you encourage people to like, well, go create one then, use Pinterest, go online, draw, play around with it a little bit. Because when you erect your own inner world the way that you want it to be and the way that you feel called to, and all of your alters and parts generally will get involved, you'll feel pulled to certain things for certain people. It does also open a passageway to the world that was already there that you didn't know about. So it's an entryway, right, to more information about yourself. There's that piece of it. But there's also that piece of all the research that we know about the brain, which is the brain doesn't always know the difference between something that's real or something that's imagined, right? We have research that shows that if you're learning to play the piano and you imagine the finger strokes to play the piano, those areas of your brain light up.
Yes.
Right. And there's some other study where I want to say it was runners. It was some type of exercise study. And the people that were imagining working out still increased muscle mass by like 12%, far less than people that were actually moving. But it was enough to prove, right, that the brain doesn't really know the difference. And so therefore, the things that we're able to do in the inner world are really, really powerful and real. So I've had folks sometimes that are like, I don't want to do that. That feels silly. But then it opens up this whole skill set to them and their life changes. And they don't ultimately think it's silly. They're worried that I think it's silly. And I don't,
Uh-huh. Yes. I remember a client once told me that one of her alters broke a window in the internal world, and she got upset with him. So he went to the hardware store and got a new piece of glass, came back and fixed the window. And this has all happened in the internal world. He didn't go to an actual outside world hardware store.
Yeah.
So his inner world included a hardware store when he needed it.
Brilliant.
Right? Yeah. So all those things happen all the time. It's like,
yeah.
And I think about, people that have a singular identity may not understand this, but I think it helps to think about your dream world. Everybody dreams. Some people say I don't remember their dreams, but they're still dreaming, I think. And, weird things happen in dreams, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some people know how to lucid dream, which means they can wake up in the dream and they can affect the dream. And I'd be interested if there's any research on this, that if people with plural identities have more ability to do lucid dreaming. I had a client that had a 6-year-old that was having trouble sleeping, caught in a trauma loop probably. So when he, as the primary alter, went to sleep at night, he would go into his internal world and lay down and bring the 6-year-old to sleep with him in a bed in the internal world. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
There are some really lovely experiences you can have with parts. I've had a few of my own that have been really moving.
Yeah. So it brings up the littles. I think that the other thing that I try to remind therapists is don't forget about the littles. It's good to do like a values evaluation with clients. What is your important values? And almost everybody has this value of, I'm going to change the cycle. I'm going to stop the cycle of abuse. Children need to be taken care of and loved and supported and not abused and not neglected, right? People believe that. And sometimes they forget about the littles inside.
Yeah.
And as a therapist, I remind them of that. I mean, I don't accuse them of being abusive, but I say, well, how does that fit? How does your values fit when you allow your littles to run amok, or you allow them to, be crying under the bed? You hear them crying. Isn't it important to find somebody to go take care of them and nurture them?
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, there's
So I think
definitely
that's
some
very
stuff that
important.
can be overwhelming, some of the things that you hear in your internal
Yeah.
world, and you don't know where to find who's distressed or how to comfort them, or you're afraid of certain parts of your inner world because there are some scary parts in some people's.
Yes. Or you may hate them,
That too.
but you can work towards the change, right? You
Yeah.
can work towards it. Yeah.
Yeah, and having a therapist who's open and understanding about that stuff certainly makes it a lot easier, more doable.
It's good to know.
Tell us about your books. You have one coming up.
I do. Yeah. So the first book I wrote was published by MSW Press, called Diagnosing and Treating Dissociative Identity Disorder, a guide for social workers and all frontline staff. So I get into quite a bit of history, and it's a lot of explanations about things. And then the second book was published by PESI, which some of you listening may be familiar with PESI, called An Introductory Clinical Guide to Dissociative Identity Disorder, Best Practices for Working with Multiplicity, Attachment Wounds, and Complex Trauma. So one of the things I like about this book is there's a lot of made-up conversations between therapists and clients. So you can kind of read those, and I obviously don't try to repeat that, but So I think that both books are helpful for a lot of people. The third book I'm going to be publishing under a new Harbinger. It's a self-help book. And one of the things I wanted to be clear about is this is directed towards people with multiple identities, but they don't have to be diagnosed to use it. Okay,
Beautiful.
I put that pretty clear. Obviously, there's always dangers in doing. I think therapy is a pretty dangerous thing to do, actually, because your life is going to get disrupted in some ways if you start doing therapy. But when people come, I figure if they come to see me, they probably already have their life in disruption, or they wouldn't take that step. I mean, it's a big step to go into therapy, right? You don't know who this person is. You don't know what they're going to do. It could make it worse, right? So when people take that step, I figure they're probably hurting quite a bit in order to take that step. Yeah, so far I've written the first 3 chapters of the book, and it would help me a lot if anybody would want to review those chapters and try them out and see if it's helped people with lived experience, and let me know. So I'd be willing to share those with a few people, with the condition that they don't share it with anybody else, just because it's not been published. It's not my work yet. It's a work in progress. But I'd love to get some input from people. So what I've done is I've really focused on the 3 C's, as well as the notions, some of the ideas I learned from narrative therapy. In narrative therapy, there's this idea of there's a dominant story or stories that live our lives, but there's always alternate stories. We're all multi-storied. And I would say with people with a poor identity, each identity may be multi-storied, or may have preferred stories and problem-saturated stories. And so I think it's very powerful. I found narrative therapy to be very powerful in my work. It probably changed when I went to Australia in 1999 and was able to learn under Michael White. It kind of kept me from burning out at that time. And it really changed my worldview and the way that I look at people and look at what's possible in terms of making changes in one's life. Interesting, he talks about identity very differently than this idea of a singular identity. And he says, a lot of people talk about the onion metaphor. Well, if we can just peel away everything and get to the core to find out who you really are. Okay. And he says, well, why not try to be something you've never been?
Love that.
Yeah. So I'm trying to incorporate some of that into this book. So it's kind of a challenge. I don't know if I've done it well. So any feedback that people can give me.
What's the best way for folks to reach out to receive the 3 chapters?
Just email me
Okay.
at gregnooney@gmail.com.
Okay.
You can,
We'll put that link in.
that'd be great. Yeah.
And this episode should come out before you have an online meeting. Did you want to talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
So I started this out, I don't know, 6 months ago or something. I had this idea that wouldn't it be, I thought maybe it would be helpful to have a forum where people with lived experience and therapists and loved ones and interested public, whatever, could get together and just have a conversation. And so I did a free one just to see what would happen. And I had, I don't know, 80 people or something. I was really surprised. And I did a little introduction, and then I just kind of had a discussion. And then I did another one where I charged $10, and I had a much smaller group, but it was a very invigorating conversation, very helpful. And some people had the idea I should keep doing this. So I'm doing one November 24th, and it just lasts an hour, although sometimes we go over, which is okay. And the idea would be, again, to just bring people. This time I'm charging $15, but if people have lived experience, they can use a coupon code and get in for free. And I already have like 30-some people signed up for it. I limited it to 50. So, yeah. And if there are any therapists out there that are wondering if it would be helpful, I think if you're a therapist, the best thing is just to come and hang out and just listen. Because a lot of people with lived experience are willing to share their stories and ask questions. And, I can provide some answers from an outsider knowledge, but it's also an opportunity for people to help each other out, So I want to see if this is something I should do on an ongoing basis. So I'll do a little survey at the end and see what people think.
So we'll make sure that we have the links to your books, to the forum sign up, along with the coupon code information for people who need it, and your email to be able to get the first 3 chapters if they'd like to review. This has been wonderful. I can't thank you enough.
I've really enjoyed it.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so grateful to Greg for sharing his wisdom, expertise, and passion. There were so many wonderful nuggets. We really appreciated the ways in which he illustrated the therapeutic partnership and the importance that he places on really honoring the uniqueness of each system that he works with. And while we all have similarities, we're all different after all. So that compassionate curiosity really does go such a long way. For resources, Greg's handouts are available for you to download at our healingmyparts.substack.com, and you'll find them in the show notes for today's episode. We really hope that you enjoy them. We'll also include the link to Greg's November 24th evening event. And if you have lived experience, the code LIVED with a D on the end, 100, will get you in for free. And we'll make sure that that is linked and the code is in the show notes as well. If you found value in this episode, we really hope that you will share it. If you're a system, maybe share it with your therapist or other system friends. And if you're a therapist, perhaps share it with your clients. If you're interested in consultation, training, or services from us, visit healingmyparts.org. And please subscribe to our blog on Substack for system life experiences, tips, and tools. And maybe consider grabbing some bite-sized nuggets for healing on our Instagram page at Healing My Parts. So until next time, thank you again, and let's keep healing. Thank you for tuning in. You can find our blog on Substack at healingmyparts.substack.com and on Instagram at healingmyparts. Just a disclaimer, any information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for professional therapy or behavioral health care. nor does listening to the podcast constitute a therapist-client relationship. Please be sure to take extra good care of you. And until next time, keep healing and thriving.